I spent most of my childhood in my grandparents' house, without ever questioning it. It was simply where afternoons went, when my parents were busy, where time moved slower, and where everything seemed to stay exactly the same year after year. The house had its own rhythm, one that didn't follow the outside world. The furniture never changed places. The curtains were always half closed, letting in just enough light to soften the rooms. The air smelled faintly of wood, old books, and something warm I could never quite name. It felt safe in a way I didn't understand yet. As a child, I noticed details without knowing why they mattered. Small things stood out not because they were loud, but because they didn't belong to my world. One of those things was an old wooden dresser in the hallway, worn smooth by decades of use. Most of its drawers opened easily. They held folded linens, old papers, and objects that felt ordinary and unimportant. I was allowed to look inside those. No one cared. They were just drawers, after all. But one drawer was different. It was always closed, always locked. A small metal keyhole sat in the center, dark and quiet, like it was watching rather than waiting. No one mentioned it. No one warned me away from it either. That silence made it louder than anything else in the house. I didn't touch it at first. I only noticed it. Every time I walked past, my eyes found it without effort. It didn't feel forbidden. It felt intentional. I remember standing there sometimes, listening to the quiet of the house, my grandparents moving slowly in another room, a radio playing softly somewhere far away. Everything calm, except for that drawer. I never asked what was inside. Not because I wasn't curious, but because something about it told me not to. Children sense these boundaries long before they understand them. The drawer didn't invite questions, it held them. I didn't know then that this was my first experience with a family secret. Not one spoken aloud, but one built into the furniture, into the routines, into the silence everyone respected without explanation. At that age, I couldn't have explained why it mattered. I only knew that it stayed with me. A small, locked presence in a house full of open doors. Over time, that drawer became part of the landscape of the house, as familiar as the ticking clock in the kitchen or the creak in the hallway floor. I passed it dozens of times a day without stopping, yet I was always aware of it. Its presence was quiet, but constant. I began to notice how my grandparents interacted with everything around it. They opened other drawers without hesitation, pulled out objects without thought, and left them open while they searched for something else. But that one drawer was never touched, not even accidentally. There was no sign saying it was off limits. No rule was ever spoken. That made it different from other things I wasn't allowed to touch. This wasn't about discipline. It was about something unspoken, something understood without words. Sometimes my grandmother would stand near it, folding linens on top of the dresser. Her movements were slow and careful, practiced over years. She never leaned against the drawer, never rested her hand there, as if even casual contact would disturb something. My grandfather passed it in silence, his steps measured, his eyes always forward. He never glanced at it. Not once. That absence of attention felt deliberate, as if looking at it required more energy than ignoring it. As a child, I didn't yet understand that adults carry weight in their bodies, that certain objects can hold memories heavy enough to shape behavior. I only sensed that this drawer wasn't empty, even without knowing what it contained. I wondered if they remembered what was inside every time they walked by, or if forgetting was part of keeping it closed. The thought lingered without forming a clear question, hovering just beyond what I could articulate. At night, when the house was quieter, the dresser seemed to stand out more. Shadows gathered around it, soft and still. The locked drawer blended into the dark, but the keyhole caught the light just enough to remain visible. I never imagined anything frightening inside. No monsters, no danger. The feeling was different from fear. It was heaviness. A sense that opening it would change something, even if I couldn't say what. That was the first time I learned that not all mysteries ask to be solved. Some simply exist, woven into everyday life, waiting for the right time to be understood. As the years passed, my curiosity about the drawer didn't fade. It changed. What began as simple noticing slowly turned into awareness, a quiet recognition that something in that house carried more history than I could see. The drawer became a marker of time, unchanged while everything else shifted around it. I grew taller. My visits became less frequent. School, friends, and other routines filled my days. But whenever I returned, the house felt exactly the same. The same furniture, the same smells, the same locked drawer, waiting without waiting. I started to notice how the house itself seemed to protect it. The hallway light was always dimmer near the dresser. The air felt cooler there, not in a way that was frightening, but in a way that encouraged stillness, as if the space asked you to slow down. Once, while my grandmother was in another room, I stood close enough to touch it. I didn't reach for the lock. I rested my hand on the wood just above it. The surface was smooth, worn by years of hands that had never opened that drawer. For a moment, I felt something I couldn't explain, not anticipation, not excitement, a quiet sadness that didn't belong to me. It passed quickly, but it left a trace behind, the way certain feelings do when they aren't meant to stay. I pulled my hand back as if I had crossed a line, not because anyone was watching, but because my body knew it had come close to something private. I didn't feel guilty. I felt respectful, without knowing why. I began to understand that the drawer wasn't locked to keep me out. It was locked to keep something in. Not an object, but a moment, a memory, a piece of life that had been set aside carefully. That realization didn't frighten me. It grounded me. It taught me that houses remember things, even when people don't speak about them. That silence can be intentional, not empty. From that day on, I stopped wondering what was inside. I started wondering who it belonged to, and why it had been given its own place to remain untouched. As I grew older, my understanding of the drawer matured with me. It stopped being a curiosity and became something closer to a presence. I didn't think about it every day, but when I was in that house, it was impossible not to feel that it existed for a reason. I noticed how conversations changed near it. Not abruptly, not obviously, but subtly. Voices lowered without anyone asking. Stories drifted toward safer subjects. The rhythm of the house seemed to slow just a little, as if the space itself remembered something the people chose not to revisit. I never heard my grandparents argue, but I sensed there were chapters of their lives that lived quietly behind closed doors. The drawer felt like one of those chapters, contained and respected, never denied but never opened either. One afternoon, I overheard my grandmother speaking softly on the phone. She wasn't crying, but her voice carried a weight I hadn't heard before. When she hung up, she stood still for a moment near the dresser, facing away from the drawer, as if gathering herself. She didn't touch it. She didn't look at it, but she stayed there longer than usual, breathing slowly before moving on. That moment stayed with me. It told me that whatever was inside the drawer wasn't forgotten. It was simply kept. I realized then that some objects serve as anchors for memory. They hold emotions that would otherwise drift into everyday life. By giving those memories a place, people can continue living without being overwhelmed by them. The drawer wasn't a secret in the dramatic sense. It wasn't hiding something shameful or dangerous. It was holding something that mattered enough to protect, even from curious eyes. That understanding changed how I felt about it. The drawer no longer invited questions. It asked for patience. It asked for time. It asked to be left alone until the moment arrived naturally. I didn't know then if that moment would ever come. I only knew that the drawer had earned its silence, and that silence felt heavier and more meaningful than any answer I could imagine. By the time I reached my teenage years, I understood something without ever being told. That drawer was not meant for me, not yet. The knowledge didn't come with disappointment. It came with acceptance, as if my body already knew the timing mattered more than the answer. I noticed how my grandparents treated time differently than everyone else I knew. They never rushed conversations. They allowed pauses to stretch. They didn't explain everything, and they didn't apologize for that. The drawer felt like part of that same philosophy. Sometimes I imagined that whatever was inside belonged to a version of them I had never met. A younger version. A time before grandchildren, before routines settled, before life slowed into something steadier. The drawer seemed to protect that earlier chapter from being disturbed. I realized how rarely adults are allowed to keep parts of themselves private, how often they are expected to explain their pasts, justify their choices, or turn memories into stories for others. That drawer resisted all of that. It kept its contents out of circulation. The older I became, the more I respected that boundary. Curiosity softened into something closer to reverence. I stopped wanting to open it and started wanting to understand why it had been closed in the first place. There were moments when I sensed grief nearby, not loud or visible, but present. A kind of grief that doesn't interrupt daily life, but quietly coexists with it. The drawer felt like the place where that grief rested when it wasn't being carried. I learned then that not all sadness looks like sadness. Some of it looks like care, like preservation, like choosing not to reopen wounds that have already been survived. The drawer had become a lesson without a teacher. It showed me that silence can be intentional, that memory can be respected without being displayed, and that love sometimes looks like leaving things exactly where they are. I didn't know what was inside, but I began to understand what it meant. And that understanding felt more valuable than any answer I could have pulled from behind that lock. Looking back now, I see that this was the first time I learned that mystery isn't always meant to be solved. Sometimes it's meant to be carried, quietly, until the right moment arrives. As adulthood approached, my visits to my grandparents' house became less frequent. Life filled up with other places, other responsibilities, other rhythms. But whenever I returned, the house welcomed me the same way, unchanged and patient, as if it had been waiting without expectation. The dresser was still there. The drawer was still locked. Time hadn't loosened it. If anything, its presence felt more intentional now, as though the years had confirmed its place rather than worn it down. I noticed how my relationship with the house had shifted. I saw it less as a backdrop for childhood, and more as a container for lives fully lived before I ever arrived. Every object seemed to carry a history I was only beginning to sense. The drawer no longer stirred curiosity in the way it once had. Instead, it brought awareness. A reminder that not everything in a family story is shared equally, and that some chapters are meant to remain closed until understanding catches up. I began to realize how rare that kind of restraint is. How often people feel pressured to explain their pain, to make sense of it for others. My grandparents had chosen a different path. They had given their memory a place, and then allowed life to continue around it. That choice felt deliberate and kind. Not avoidance, but care. A way of honoring something without letting it define every moment that followed. The drawer stood as proof that survival sometimes looks like containment. I understood then that growing up isn't only about gaining access to more information. It's about learning when information isn't yours yet. When knowing too soon would take something away, instead of adding understanding. The locked drawer had taught me that lesson without words. It had shown me that boundaries can exist without conflict, and that respect doesn't always require explanation. Standing there as an adult, I felt gratitude instead of curiosity. Gratitude for the trust that had been placed in silence, and for the patience that silence had taught me. I didn't know when, or if, that drawer would ever be opened. But I knew one thing clearly. Whatever was inside had been protected with intention, and that intention mattered just as much as the contents themselves. There came a time when the house felt quieter than usual. Not empty, but altered. The familiar sounds were still there, yet something in the rhythm had shifted. I sensed it before anyone said a word, the way you sense changes in a place you know well. My grandmother moved more slowly then. Her steps were careful, her pauses longer. The house seemed to respond by becoming gentler, as if it knew to make room for her pace. The dresser remained untouched, steady in the hallway, holding its silence without effort. I found myself noticing the drawer differently, not as an object of mystery, but as a witness. It had been there through everything, through joy I never saw, through losses I was only beginning to understand. It had outlasted moments and moods alike. One afternoon, I stood alone in the hallway longer than usual. The house breathed around me, soft and still. For the first time, I wondered what would happen if the drawer were opened now. Not what I would find, but how it would change the space. That question surprised me. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was concern. I realized that opening the drawer might disturb something that had been carefully balanced for decades. Not because it was dangerous, but because it had found its place. I understood then that the drawer had become part of the house's structure, not physically, but emotionally. Removing its silence might leave an absence no one was prepared to fill. The idea stayed with me. How some things are not kept closed out of fear, but out of respect for the lives that learned how to go on around them. The drawer felt like one of those things. I thought about how many families have similar objects. Boxers, rooms, photographs that remain untouched not because they are forgotten, but because they are remembered too clearly. Standing there, I felt a quiet responsibility. Not to open the drawer, but to understand its role. To recognize that silence can be active, holding space for what cannot be revisited without cost. That was when I stopped seeing the drawer as something waiting to be opened. I began seeing it as something that had already done its job, faithfully, for many years. After that visit, the drawer followed me in ways I didn't expect. Not as an image, but as a feeling that surfaced in other places. I noticed how often I encountered silence that wasn't empty, how some pauses carried intention rather than absence. I began to recognize that same quiet weight in other homes. A shelf no one dusted, a box never moved, a room that stayed closed without explanation. These weren't accidents. They were decisions made gently, then honored over time. The drawer taught me that curiosity isn't always the highest form of respect. Sometimes restraint carries more care than knowing ever could. That understanding settled into me slowly, reshaping how I approached other people's histories. I realized how often we assume that understanding requires access, that if something exists, we're meant to open it, explain it, resolve it. The drawer stood as proof that some things remain meaningful, precisely because they are not revisited. I thought about my grandparents then, about the lives they had lived before I knew them, the versions of themselves that existed without me, the joys and losses that shaped them into the people I loved. The drawer felt like a bridge to that unseen time, even without being opened. There was comfort in knowing that something had been protected so carefully, that pain, if it existed there, had been given a place to rest instead of being carried endlessly. The house had made room for both memory and peace. I noticed how that realization softened me. I became more patient with unanswered questions, more willing to let stories remain incomplete. I stopped pressing for explanations where none were offered. The drawer had become a teacher in that way, not through revelation, but through consistency. It showed me that boundaries can be loving, and that silence can be a form of care. And as I carried that lesson forward, I understood something quietly important. Some things are not closed because we are afraid of what's inside, but because opening them would take away the balance that took years to build. As time went on, I started to notice how rare that kind of balance is. How often people feel compelled to reopen old chapters, searching for closure that never truly arrives. The drawer had never offered closure. It offered continuity, and that felt more honest. I thought about how my grandparents had lived with that decision for so long. How many days they had passed that dresser without stopping. How many times they had chosen not to open what was already known to them. That choice took strength, even if it looked like nothing from the outside. The older I became, the more I understood that not everything heals through exposure. Some things heal through containment, through being acknowledged quietly and then allowed to rest. The drawer embodied that idea without ever saying a word. I began to see echoes of it in my own life, moments I chose not to revisit, memories I learned to place gently, somewhere safe, instead of pulling them out again and again. The drawer had given me permission to do that. I noticed how differently my body responded to memories I kept contained versus ones I forced myself to confront. One felt steady, the other felt raw. The drawer had taught me the value of discernment, even if I hadn't realized it at the time. That lesson changed how I listened to others. I didn't rush them toward explanations. I didn't assume silence meant avoidance. Sometimes silence meant respect for something still tender. The drawer had never demanded attention. It simply remained. That steadiness became something I valued deeply. A reminder that time doesn't always need to resolve what it touches. I wondered then if my grandparents ever talked about what was inside, late at night, when the house was asleep, or if they had reached a point where words were no longer necessary. The question stayed gentle, unanswered. Standing in that hallway years later, I felt less like a child with curiosity and more like an adult with understanding. The drawer no longer represented mystery. It represented care. And in that shift, I realized something important. Some secrets aren't secrets at all. They are agreements with time, quietly honored, asking only to be left where they are. It wasn't until much later that I understood how intentional that agreement with time really was. My grandparents hadn't ignored the drawer. They had integrated it into their lives in a way that allowed everything else to keep moving. The silence around it wasn't avoidance. It was structure. I began to see how often people mistake reopening for healing. How easily we assume that revisiting pain is the only way to honor it. The drawer suggested something else entirely. That honoring can also mean setting something down and choosing not to carry it every day. That idea stayed with me as my own life grew more complicated. There were experiences I didn't want to define myself by. Memories I needed to acknowledge once, then place somewhere safe. The drawer gave me a model for doing that without shame. I noticed how my grandparents' home felt balanced because of it. Not weighed down by the past, but not pretending it never existed either. The drawer existed in plain sight, neither hidden nor displayed. It was simply part of the house. That balance felt rare. It explained why the home always felt calm, even when life outside was chaotic. Nothing was fighting to be resolved there. Everything had its place, including what could not be changed. I realized that this was a kind of wisdom I hadn't been taught anywhere else, not in school, not in conversations. It was learned through observation, through living alongside an example rather than being told what to do. The drawer had quietly taught me that healing doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like integration, like making room for what happened without letting it dominate what comes next. As I stood there years later, I felt grateful for that lesson. Not because it answered any questions, but because it showed me a way to live with unanswered ones. The drawer no longer felt heavy to me. It felt complete, like something that had already been carried as far as it needed to go. And in understanding that, I knew I was no longer meant to open it. I was meant to learn from the way it had been kept closed. Not long after that realization, the house changed again. This time, the change was unmistakable. My grandfather was gone, and his absence settled into the rooms in a way that words never could. The furniture stayed where it was, but the air felt different, thinner somehow. My grandmother moved through the house with the same routines, but they carried more weight now. Each action felt deliberate, as if she were choosing what to keep steady in a world that had quietly shifted. The drawer remained untouched, unchanged, still holding its place. I found myself noticing it more often then. Not because I wanted to open it, but because it felt like one of the few things that hadn't been altered by loss. It stood as it always had, a constant in a house learning how to be different. There were moments when my grandmother paused near it, her back turned, her hands resting lightly on the dresser. She never reached for the lock. She didn't need to. Whatever it held was already with her, whether she opened it or not. I realized then that the drawer wasn't just about the past. It was about continuity, about carrying something forward without disturbing it, about allowing memory to exist alongside daily life without demanding attention. That understanding softened my grief. It showed me that not everything needs to be processed loudly or immediately. Some things are honored through quiet endurance, through letting life continue around them. The drawer became a kind of companion in that period. Not a comfort, exactly, but a presence that reminded me of resilience. It had witnessed change before. It would witness it again. I began to see how my grandparents had built a life that could absorb loss without collapsing. The drawer was part of that architecture, a place where something painful had been set down so that everything else could remain standing. Standing there with my grandmother, I felt the weight of generations settling into something calm. Loss had entered the house, but it had not taken over. And in that moment, I understood that the drawer had never been about secrecy. It had been about survival, practiced quietly, one day at a time. After my grandfather's absence became part of the house, time began to move differently there. Days were quieter, slower, shaped by repetition instead of anticipation. The drawer remained where it always had, unchanged, steady in a space, learning a new rhythm. I noticed how my grandmother adjusted without announcing it. She didn't remove his things all at once. She didn't preserve them either. She allowed objects to stay where they were until they no longer needed to be there. The drawer seemed to guide that pace, patient and unhurried. There were afternoons when we sat together without speaking. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It felt shared. I understood then that she didn't need to talk about what she missed. She was already living with it. Carefully, every day. The drawer felt closer during those moments. Not physically, but emotionally. It held something that belonged to both of them. Something that had survived other losses before this one. It had learned how to stay closed without being forgotten. I realized then that grief doesn't always ask for expression. Sometimes it asks for structure, for a place to rest so that the rest of life can keep moving. The drawer had provided that structure long before I understood what it was doing. I began to see how that lesson extended beyond that house, how people carry grief differently, and how the quiet ones are often doing the most careful work. The drawer taught me to respect that kind of strength. There were questions I could have asked my grandmother, opportunities to break the silence. But something told me not to. Not because the answers were forbidden, but because the timing wasn't mine to choose. The drawer had taught me patience before. Now it taught me restraint. It showed me that love doesn't always reach for understanding. Sometimes it stays close enough to honor what cannot be shared. As I left the house that day, I understood something important. The drawer didn't hold a secret meant to be revealed. It held a memory that had already been carried, and was now being protected so life could continue around it. And that understanding stayed with me, quietly reshaping how I learned to sit with what others choose not to open. As years passed, the house began to feel more like a place of memory than of routine. Visits were shorter, less frequent. Each time I arrived, I noticed small changes, but the drawer remained untouched, anchoring the space in something older and steadier than change. I started to understand that the drawer wasn't only holding the past, it was also holding continuity. It allowed everything else to shift without collapsing. As long as it stayed closed, something essential remained intact. I realized how rare that kind of stability is, how few objects are allowed to keep their meaning without being repurposed, explained, or turned into stories for others. The drawer resisted all of that quietly. My grandmother aged gracefully, carrying loss without spectacle. The drawer stayed with her, a companion she never needed to acknowledge. It was enough that it existed, enough that it remained where it always had. I noticed how carefully she preserved the house's rhythm. Meals at the same time, windows opened the same way, evenings settling into familiar silence. The drawer felt woven into those routines, an unspoken agreement between memory and survival. I understood then that grief doesn't disappear when it's hidden. It transforms when it's given boundaries. The drawer had given my grandparents those boundaries long before I arrived to notice them. That realization changed how I saw inheritance. It wasn't just objects or stories passed down. It was ways of coping, ways of holding pain without letting it define every day. The drawer was part of that inheritance. I felt grateful for having witnessed it, even without knowing its contents. The lesson wasn't inside the drawer. It was in the way it had been respected for decades. Standing there one last time, I knew I still wasn't meant to open it. Understanding had already arrived, quietly, without a key, and I carried that understanding with me, knowing some things teach us more by staying closed than they ever could by being revealed. There came a moment when I realized the house would not stay the same forever. It wasn't sudden. It arrived slowly, through small signs I couldn't ignore anymore. Rooms felt larger. Silence lingered longer. The routines that once held everything together began to loosen at the edges. The drawer, however, did not change. It remained locked, steady, as if it belonged to a different sense of time. While everything else adjusted to absence and aging, it held its position without question. I noticed how my grandmother's presence filled the house differently now. She was quieter, but not weaker. Her movements carried intention. Each action seemed chosen rather than automatic, as if she understood the value of what remained. Sometimes she sat near the hallway, resting, her gaze unfocused. The dresser was always within sight, though she never looked directly at it. I sensed that whatever it held was already part of her, no longer needing to be touched or revisited. I began to understand that memory does not fade in the same way objects wear down. It settles. It integrates. The drawer wasn't holding something fragile anymore. It was holding something complete. That realization softened my fear of loss. It showed me that letting go doesn't mean erasing. It means trusting that what mattered has already found its place inside you. The drawer had done its work long before I understood it. It had given shape to grief, boundaries to memory, and space for life to continue. It didn't need to be opened to fulfill its purpose. Standing there, I felt a quiet acceptance. Some questions do not demand answers. Some doors remain closed, not because we are excluded, but because their role has already been fulfilled. And in that moment, I knew the drawer was no longer about the past. It was about continuity, about how people learn to live fully without reopening everything they've survived. When the time finally came to think about the house changing hands, the weight of it surprised me. It wasn't about walls or furniture. It was about what had been carried there, quietly, for generations. The drawer felt heavier then, not because of its contents, but because of what it had witnessed. I realized how much of my understanding of family had been shaped in that hallway. Not through stories told aloud, but through what was left unsaid. The drawer had taught me to pay attention to absence, to read meaning in restraint, rather than revelation. I thought about how easily that lesson could be lost, how quickly objects are sorted, donated, discarded when a house is emptied, how little patience we often have for what doesn't immediately explain itself. The drawer asked for patience one last time. For the first time, I wondered if opening it might feel like betrayal, not of a person, but of a way of living, a way that trusted silence to do its work without interference. The thought made my chest tighten, not with fear, but with responsibility. I understood then that inheritance is not only about what we receive, it is about what we choose not to disturb, what we allow to remain intact because it has already done what it needed to do. The drawer didn't ask me to protect it forever. It asked me to understand it before acting, to recognize that opening something is not always an act of courage. Sometimes courage is knowing when to leave things as they are. I felt gratitude for having been taught that distinction so early, without knowing it at the time. The drawer had modeled restraint more powerfully than any conversation ever could. As I stood there, imagining the future of the house, I knew one thing clearly. Whatever happened next, the lesson the drawer carried would not be lost. It had already moved from wood and metal into memory. And with that realization, the need to know what was inside finally faded. What mattered had already been given, quietly, over many years. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking less about the drawer itself, and more about what it had shaped in me. How it had quietly taught me to sit with uncertainty, without needing to resolve it. How it had shown me that meaning doesn't always come from answers. I noticed how often people rush toward explanations when something feels uncomfortable. How quickly silence is filled, questions are pressed, and stories are demanded. The drawer had existed outside of that impulse, and in doing so, it had offered an alternative way of being. That alternative began to show up in my own life. I became more patient with pauses, in conversations, more respectful of what others chose not to share. I understood that trust isn't built by access alone, but by honoring boundaries when they appear. I realized then that the drawer had been teaching me about dignity, about allowing experiences to remain whole instead of breaking them apart for understanding. It had protected not just a memory, but the integrity of it. I thought about my grandparents again, about the decisions they made quietly, without ceremony. How many times they must have chosen to leave that drawer closed, not because it was easy, but because it was right for them. That kind of choice doesn't announce itself. It doesn't look dramatic, but it shapes the atmosphere of a life in lasting ways. It shaped the calm of that house. It shaped the way grief was held there. Standing with that understanding, I felt a sense of continuity, as if something had been passed to me without being handed over. A way of carrying what matters without needing to display it. The drawer no longer felt like an object tied to a place. It felt like a principle I could carry anywhere. A reminder that some things are preserved best by being left untouched. And in realizing that, I understood the drawer had already been opened in the only way that mattered. Not with a key, but with time, patience, and attention. As I prepared to leave the house for what might be the last time, I walked through each room slowly, letting my steps match the pace the house had always asked for. I wasn't looking for objects to take with me. I was paying attention to how the space felt now, quieter but still full. The hallway felt longer than I remembered. The light fell softly across the floor, and the air carried that familiar stillness that had always made the house feel separate from the outside world. Nothing rushed me there. Nothing ever had. I stopped in front of the dresser without thinking. The drawer was still locked, unchanged, exactly where it had always been. Seeing it again didn't bring curiosity. It brought recognition, like greeting someone who had already said everything they needed to say. I realized how much of my understanding of family had been shaped in that narrow space. Not through explanations or stories, but through observation, through learning when to pause, when to listen, and when to let silence speak for itself. The drawer had never demanded attention, yet it had always been present. It had quietly taught me that some parts of life are not meant to be processed quickly. That meaning can deepen when it is allowed to remain undisturbed. I thought about how different my life might have been if everything had been explained to me too soon. If every question had been answered, every mystery resolved. I understood then that not knowing had been part of the gift. The house had given me that gift repeatedly. It had trusted me to grow into understanding instead of forcing it upon me. The drawer was the clearest symbol of that trust. Standing there, I felt a sense of completion. Not because anything had ended, but because something had been fully carried. The drawer no longer felt heavy. It felt settled, like a chapter that had found its place. I knew then that opening it would not add meaning to what I had learned. It would only change the form, not the truth. The lesson had already arrived in the way it was meant to. As I turned away, I understood something quietly final. Some things are not meant to be revealed. They are meant to shape us slowly, from the edges of our awareness, until one day we realize we no longer need to know what was inside. Leaving the house didn't feel like an ending in the way I once imagined endings should feel. There was no sudden weight, no sharp sadness. What I felt instead was a quiet understanding, the kind that settles in slowly and stays without asking to be examined. As I closed the door behind me, I realized that I wasn't leaving the drawer behind. I was carrying what it had taught me. The patience, the restraint, the ability to live alongside unanswered questions without needing to resolve them immediately. I thought about how much of my life had been shaped by that lesson without my noticing. How often I had chosen not to press, not to open, not to demand explanations from people, or from myself. The drawer had given me that instinct long before I knew why it mattered. In a world that often insists on disclosure, clarity, and constant understanding, that instinct felt rare. It reminded me that some truths are felt more deeply when they remain intact, protected from being handled too often. I understood then that the drawer had never been about secrecy. It had been about care, about giving memory a place where it could exist without being disturbed, about allowing life to continue without dragging every past moment into the present. That realization stayed with me as I drove away. The house grew smaller in the distance, but the lesson remained close. It had moved beyond the wood and metal, beyond the hallway and the lock. I didn't feel regret for never knowing what was inside. Instead, I felt gratitude for what had been given to me without being opened. The drawer had done its work quietly, faithfully, over many years. I know now that some of the most important things we inherit are not objects or stories, but ways of holding what matters. Ways of protecting meaning without turning it into something fragile. When I think back on that house, I don't remember answers. I remember atmosphere. I remember steadiness. I remember learning that silence can be intentional, and that restraint can be an act of love. And if there is one thing that drawer taught me, it is this: not everything we carry is meant to be unpacked. Some things are meant to stay exactly where they are, shaping us gently, long after we've moved on. After leaving that place behind, I noticed how often the memory of the drawer returned in moments that had nothing to do with my grandparents' house. It appeared quietly, usually when I was tempted to push for answers that weren't ready to be given. I saw it in conversations where someone hesitated before sharing, in pauses that felt heavier than words. Instead of filling those spaces, I learned to recognize them. The drawer had taught me that hesitation often protects something still alive. I realized how different my reactions had become over time. Where I once might have pressed for clarity, I now paused. Where I once believed understanding required access, I learned that respect sometimes requires distance. That shift didn't make life easier, but it made it more honest. I stopped demanding closure where none was possible. I stopped mistaking silence for absence. The drawer had changed the way I interpreted what was left unsaid. I began to understand how many people carry their own locked drawers. Not physical ones, but emotional spaces where memories are kept carefully, away from constant inspection. Those spaces aren't walls. They're shelters. The more I noticed this, the more I understood how universal the lesson was. Families, relationships, even entire generations carry things forward this way. Not everything survives being reopened. Some things survive because they are not. The drawer had given me a language for this that didn't rely on words. It had shown me how to live alongside mystery without turning it into fear, how to let meaning exist without forcing it into clarity. I felt grateful for having learned that lesson early, even without realizing it. It allowed me to meet others with more patience, more gentleness, and less urgency to understand everything immediately. Looking back, I see how the drawer shaped not just my memories, but my posture toward life itself. It taught me to move more slowly toward the things that matter, and to listen for what is being protected, rather than what is being hidden. And as that understanding settled in, I knew the story wasn't finished yet. There was still one more thing the drawer had taught me. Something only visible when everything else had already been carried forward. Only now, with enough distance to see the whole shape of it, do I understand what the drawer was really teaching me all along. It wasn't asking me to solve a mystery. It was asking me to learn how to live without needing to. The drawer showed me that maturity doesn't always arrive through answers. Sometimes it arrives through restraint, through learning when curiosity serves understanding and when it only disrupts what has already found its balance. I see now that my grandparents didn't keep something locked away out of fear or denial. They did it out of care. They understood that some memories deserve protection, not exposure. That some parts of life are honored best by being left intact. That lesson followed me far beyond that house. It shaped how I hold my own past, how I relate to others' stories, how I understand that not everything meaningful needs to be opened, explained, or shared. In a world that constantly pushes us to unpack everything, to revisit everything, to name and expose every experience, the drawer offered a different kind of wisdom. It reminded me that peace sometimes comes from knowing when to stop looking. I didn't inherit what was inside that drawer. I inherited the way it was kept. The patience, the respect, the understanding that survival can be quiet, and that strength doesn't always announce itself. When I think of my grandparents now, I don't imagine what they placed inside. I imagine the decision they made every day to keep living fully, while carrying something gently, without letting it take over. That choice shaped the calm of their home. It shaped the rhythm of their lives. And without realizing it at the time, it shaped me too. I no longer wonder what was inside the drawer. The question has lost its weight. What mattered was never the contents, but the care that surrounded it for so many years. And if there's one thing I carry forward from that house, it's this: not everything we carry needs to be opened. Some things are meant to stay closed, shaping us quietly, long after the door has been left behind.